On this day, exactly 75 years ago, Walt Disney released his animated production, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, a package film consisting of two adaptations of beloved stories, The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Whether you've seen them in this format or separately, both segments have continued to stand the test of time, and of the packaged films produced by Disney during the 1940s, this is probably the most well-regarded. Originally, the plan was just to adapt The Wind in the Willows as a feature film, which was announced by Disney in 1940. However, as the artists were working on the story, they found it worked much better in a shorter length than trying to pad it out to feature length. Thus, the decision was made to pair it up with another story, which ended up being Sleepy Hollow. The Wind in the Willows segment has a lot of charm and allows the animators plenty of opportunities to have fun with these animal characters. The story is of course centered on Mr. Toad and his excitement when he sees a motor car and the complications that arise when he becomes obsessed with the vehicle. The animators put a lot of necessary bounce into Mr. Toad's movements, and a particularly inspired casting choice was hiring Eric Blore for the voice. Blore primarily made a name for himself in Hollywood playing butlers, and often appeared in Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers musicals, and this allowed him the chance to play a truly energetic and eccentric character. His friends, Rat, Mole, and personal accountant McBadger provide delightful personalities of their own, and the only characters in this world who attempt to set him straight. There's also his horse Cyril, and then there are the villainous weasels who take over Toad Hall when he signs over the deed. Those weasels would later be used as villains in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which shows how memorable they were. The segment takes aim at the legal system, and there are other cleverly done sequences, like the climax in Toad Hall, when the heroes come swinging in to take it back. The segment was narrated by Basil Rathbone, who at the time was widely known for playing Sherlock Holmes in a series of movies. He brought a calm and elegant quality to the narration. I also want to mention the device of having these stories told to us in a library. It's a well-known element of classic Disney animated movies that they open with a book being read to the audience, but the idea of using a library setting to take us to each story is nonetheless an inspired one. They were able to pack an impressive amount of story into around 30 minutes and have it move at a solid pace. According to Frank Thomas, who was heavily involved with putting the segment together, most everyone involved felt the story worked much better when it was moving at top speed, and that any attempts to add more just slowed things down. Walt Disney even asked for more scenes to be cut, and yet despite this, it never feels like anything has been lost, although Thomas did express disappointment at some of the material that was removed. It's a solidly done segment with a lot of bounce, but also with the proper stakes, especially when Toad is sent to prison and then escapes. I do think the best thing to come out of Disney's The Wind in the Willows is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. For whatever reason, I absolutely loved going it the first time I visited the Magic Kingdom of Walt Disney World. Yes, the ride that ends with you being sent to prison, run over by a train, and landing in hell, and I would ask to go on it again and again. Even though it still exists at Disneyland, Disney decided to close the Magic Kingdom version in 1998 and replaced it with a Winnie the Pooh ride. While I enjoy the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh when I visited the park a second time, I still don't quite understand why Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was closed in the East Coast. Anyway, while the Wind in the Willows segment has its fans, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow tends to be the most talked about segment, and has become a Halloween tradition for many. One of the things that most stands out to me about this segment is the character of Ichabod Crane. He is not the typical Disney protagonist, as he's basically a self-absorbed gold digger who just wants to marry the local pretty girl Katrina because of her father's money and to stuff himself silly with food. They make very little attempt to make him sympathetic, and in fact there's not a single good person in this entire segment. Brahm is a bully who frequently messes with Ichabod in a competition to woo Katrina, although Brahm is not nearly as bad a person as Ichabod is. Meanwhile, she delights in messing with their infatuations. It gives you pretty much nobody to root for, and that's something different for a Disney production, which more often than not gives you clear heroes who you hope defeat the villain. The segment was narrated by Bing Crosby, who was a massive star at the time and would have been an enormous get for Disney. He brings his famous vocals, not only the narration, but the singing parts too, like Brahms' catchy song about the Headless Horseman, which is used to scare Ichabod. Outside of a few screams, laughs, and other sounds, the segment is pretty much dialogueless, and the animators did an exceptional job, especially Frank Thomas on Ichabod. The directors and artists also developed the proper mood for Sleepy Hollow, with that appropriate Halloween vibe, especially in the later parts of the segment. The highlight of the entire film is absolutely the ending, when Ichabod goes riding off at night. It's a brilliantly constructed sequence, starting off with Ichabod being fearful of the Headless Horseman popping up at any moment. Then he finally shows up, and what a brilliant piece of animation he is. Even though he has no head, we immediately understand his whole deal as he delights in chasing after Ichabod with sword in hand. I think this is one of the most exciting sequences ever produced for a Disney animated film. The entire chase is thrilling, and the artist succeeded showing how unrelenting and dangerous the horseman is. And when they throw in a few comedy bits, they feel natural and highlight the fear Ichabod is having in that moment. People have this stereotype of animated Disney movies being these happy-go-lucky drawings with dancing flowers and chirping birds. However, Walt Disney and his artists were willing to go to some dark and frightening places with their films. He is often accused of watering down animation and turning it exclusively a children's medium. But I wonder if those critics have gone back and looked at Snow White, Pinocchio, and this movie in particular, because those films had no problem putting in imagery that could lead to childhood nightmares. Honestly, the entire movie feels like a build-up to this sequence, and even though Ichabod's name comes first in the title, it was a smart choice to put Sleepy Hollow second on the roster, as it would have been jarring to go from the end of this to the beginning of Wind in the Willows. And much like Irving's short story, the film ends on an ambiguous note about Ichabod's fate and who really was the Headless Horseman. For the most part, the story team stayed largely faithful, only omitting a few things here and there. It's a strong adaptation of the source material, and much like Wind in the Willows, it was smart of them to keep it at this length rather than try and stretch it out. While these stories are obviously different in tone, they nonetheless manage to pair up well together. They do both involve lead characters whose hubris gets the better of them, although things do turn out happier for Mr. Toad than for Ichabod, due to his support system able to reel him in, something Ichabod did not have. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad would become the last package film produced by Disney during this time, as the studio immediately went back to telling feature-length animated stories starting with Cinderella. For years, the segments were shown separately on television and home video, and I'm sure that people were surprised they were originally tied together. Thankfully, the original version eventually became available again, and is now the most widely accessible way to watch the film. The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad show the mastery of the Disney artists, their ability of retelling classic stories with their signature touch, and their continued willingness to push the animation art form and utilize certain cinematic techniques to their advantage. See you next time.